Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining virtually. I know we have a lot of you. As Liz mentioned, my name is Alan Fitz. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Communications at American Express. So in that role, I oversee our communications globally, or help oversee our communications globally with a large team, as well as corporate policy, philanthropy, and ESG work. But I'm here today as a proud board member for the Alliance for Peacebuilding. I just want to start by saying it's a real honor to be in this room with you all. I am eternally impressed and inspired by the work that you all do to make the world a more just, more equitable, and more peaceful place. I have the great pleasure today of introducing you to our keynote speaker, Sherrie Westin. I've known Sherrie for many years now, so it's particularly fun for me to be on this stage today. Sherrie's the president of Sesame Workshop, the nonprofit education organization behind Sesame Street. In this role, Sherrie raises awareness, develops strategic partnerships, cultivates philanthropic support to further the workshop's mission to help children everywhere grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. This work directly helps reduce conflict all around the globe. We're going to dive into this a little bit more later, but among her many impressive accomplishments, Sherrie spearheaded an innovative partnership with the International Rescue Committee to bring critical early education to children in the Syrian response region. This program was awarded the MacArthur Foundation's first ever $100 million grant, creating the largest early childhood intervention in history. This work has since been replicated and expanded to reach children affected by crisis in Bangladesh, East Africa, Latin America, and those who've been displaced from Afghanistan and Ukraine. Sherrie's received many awards for her work. She was named the leading global thinker by Foreign Policy magazine, one of Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business, the Smithsonian's American Ingenuity Award, and the Thomas Jefferson Medal for Citizen Leadership. I'm honored to share the stage with Sherrie today. Okay.
So you can hear from this without holding?
I hope so. Can you all get us? Good? No.
So you want us to hold?
Okay. First, I just want to thank you for being here, Sherrie.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you.
This is amazing. I love that video. It really sort of gives a taste of the amazing work that you do. And we have a diverse audience, both here in the room and those joining virtually, truly global in nature. But as I was thinking through what sort of unites us as a group, Sesame Street is probably one of the experiences that all of us in this room have in common. And so I thought, just a quick show of hands, raise your hand if Sesame Street was somehow part of your childhood, or maybe your kids' childhood, or your nieces or nephews. I mean, I think it's pretty much everyone. And I think that's really kind of remarkable. I know I don't think I fully comprehended how global and universal Sesame Street was, though, until I started to do a little bit more digging in advance of this talk, and I thought others might not as well. So I thought I'd just start by asking you to share a little bit more about the depth and breadth of your work at Sesame.
I'd be happy to, and thank you again for having me. It's such a treat to be here with Alan, and thank you, Liz, and the entire board. I am so impressed with this organization and with the convening power, and it's really an honor to be a part of it. And I'm so glad you got to see the video first, because I think that gives you a broader understanding. In spite of all the people that raise their hand knowing Sesame Street, you know, I think a lot of people think of Sesame Street as the iconic US television show and don't always know the depth of our work. And we are, you know, now seen in over 150 different countries. But as you saw in the video, I think the work that is most impactful is in those countries where we've created local adaptations, local characters designed to meet the needs of children, reflecting their cultures. And I always love it because the founder of Sesame Street, the creators, Joan Gance Cooney, said in the 1960s she thought she was creating the quintessential American show on a stoop in Harlem. And within a year, Mexico, Germany, Brazil all reached out and said they wanted their own versions of Sesame Street. And that's what led to our international co-productions. The other thing that I think is of real note is it was in the 1990s. I believe it started in the first Bush administration and has carried on ever since, was when we started receiving funding from USAID to create these productions in developing countries like South Africa, Egypt, Bangladesh, today Iraq. So that really led to our work in areas where children often don't have access to quality early education.
So you've endured and grown over the past 50 years, grown geographically, as you said, hitting 150 nations. I want to ask you, how have you done that? How have you managed to remain relevant, remain impactful, and at the same time, you're pushing the envelope often, right? You're talking about things that are hard to talk about sometimes. And so, continually to advance the conversation, how have you managed to thread that needle?
Well, I think about this a lot. And actually, I think that's exactly the reason we've stayed relevant for over 50 years, is because we're always focused on the most pressing issues of today and looking at those issues through the lens of a child. So as those issues have changed, we have responded. And we've stayed completely true to our mission. Created over 53 years ago to see if television at the time, but media, could be used to teach, and especially to reach those who were falling behind and didn't have the same opportunities and access to quality or early education. So fast forward, global pandemic, more children with no access to school for ages, right? More people displaced today than any other time since World War II, almost half of whom are children. So the need for our work has never been greater. And also the opportunity, it's not just television anymore, it's every means, digital, high-tech, low-tech. So we have such an opportunity to continue to reach children with quality early learning. And I'll say one more thing. I've been at Sesame a long time, but I still have these incredible aha moments and learning moments. And I think a lot about the incredible prescience of Joan Cooney and her colleagues. First show to ever focus on the early years, because they thought that's when they could have the greatest impact. And now we have all of the neuroscience, all of the evidence to show that in fact those first 5 years of life are the most important in a child's brain development. We also, I also think one of the other things that I love is she said she had a hunch that if Sesame appealed to adults as well as children, the learning would go deeper. And that's why she included celebrities and musicians and parodies and humor. I think today we also, that is such a secret sauce for Sesame, because we also have the brain science to show that the way a child learns is through engagement with an adult, and Sesame appeals to both, which is a very powerful asset, I have to say.
So I want to talk a little bit more about that brain science and the way that trauma can actually physically change you. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, but I think that notion of how trauma and crises actually can physically change a person and then also be passed down and sort of become cyclical.
Well, it's the reason I think that this appeal to adults is in fact so powerful for Sesame, because if you take it further, we also know that those first 5 years are when a child's brain is most susceptible to their environment. And if you've read or heard at all about toxic stress, when a child is exposed to prolonged exposure to adversity, to trauma, it literally inhibits brain development. It literally, the hormonal response affects their ability to form synapses. But what is the most effective way to mitigate that negative, devastating effect? It's more engagement with a caring adult, what's called nurturing care. So that's where Sesame comes in. In many of these places, particularly in our work in conflict and children displaced in humanitarian settings, our tools are for children, but they're also designed as a catalyst, to become a catalyst for engagement between adult and child. So that's why I think that appeal to adults is so incredibly powerful. And if you're not reaching children in those critical early years when they're experiencing those, what could be more traumatic than being displaced, leaving everything behind? And if we're not reaching them, we're putting them at a long-term disadvantage that not only affects their ability to learn, but their long-term health and productivity. So how can they be expected to have the skills they need to rebuild society if we're not giving them those tools at an early age?
So I want to talk peace building, which is why we are all here today. This audience is comprised of peace builders in many different forms and fashions, collectively approaching the elements of peace from integrated angles, whether it be climate change, food insecurity, technology, trauma, health. Sesame Workshop touches a lot of those, but also focuses on a critical element of peace, which is education, and specifically early childhood education. Education, of course, can be used to fuel conflict as much as it can to build peace. And so it obviously is critical and can be used both ways. But so why is education and the well-being of our youngest children so important to consider when it comes to building peace and preventing conflict?
Well, I think what you asked me to explain on the importance of the early years in terms of trauma and that impact is a huge part of this. I'm speaking to an audience that will agree how important it is. You know, it's Gandhi who said if we want to build real peace, we have to start with children, and it seems obvious to me. One of the other things Joan said when she started was it wasn't a question of whether children learned from television at the time or media, it was what they learned. And so not only reaching children who are affected by crisis to give them those tools, but also we've had a long history, some of this you saw, of working in areas of conflict and post-conflict, places like Kosovo and Israeli-Palestinian territories, Northern Ireland, and we would focus specifically on promoting ideas of open-mindedness, of cooperation, of accepting others. When children see themselves reflected positively, it's an incredibly empowering opportunity to teach. And when they see others reflected in a positive light, I think of our work in Kosovo. All of our research is hugely important to Sesame to prove, are we having the impact we need? What can we do differently so we can iterate? And we have all research that shows that in these productions and in the content we create, children rate higher on attitudes of sharing, on attitudes of cooperation, on ability to see others' perspectives, and on more acceptance of those who are different. So we like to call it Muppet diplomacy, but I just think it speaks to the power of not only giving children the quality early childhood development they need, but also reaching in them at a time when they're forming their sense of self and their sense of the world.
So you talked a bit about, we saw a bit in the video, this localized approach that you've taken in certain markets, and that's especially critical when you're asking and looking for kids to be able to see themselves. It needs to be highly localized. And so while everyone knows Big Bird and Elmo probably in this room, you may not realize the degree to which Sesame creates unique characters around the world in specific cultures and contexts to help children see themselves. So there's sort of two parts to this. I want to first talk about the process. So how do you go about making sure that this content actually reflects the local culture in a way that children and caregivers feel seen?
Well, I mentioned research. It's critical. We also always start by finding local partners, local advisors, local educators, local creators. We start with an advisory and needs assessments. So while we have a model that's proven in terms of our ability to teach, we learn and make sure that we are not imposing our views, but this is a local creation, that it's a local production, that the curriculum is designed by those on the ground who understand those needs. So it's always about helping, to your point, children see themselves, creating content that reflects their reality. So it would be characters they can identify with, storylines they could identify with. And I'll give you an example in terms of character development. In our work in the Middle East, Ahlan Simpson, which is Welcome Sesame, and as you mentioned earlier, it's in Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. Two new Muppet characters were created, Bosma and Jod. Bosma is this adorable little purple Muppet girl, strong girl role model. Jod had to leave his home and leaves everything behind and becomes best friends with Bosma. So you're giving storylines to children who've left and who have come from somewhere, characters they can relate to. I mentioned Bosma being a strong girl role model, and they're equals. Bosma and Jod become best friends. They solve problems together. Another value that we always include in any of our work is promoting gender equity, having strong girl role models in terms of these Muppets. I mean, you'd be amazed at what influence and how these characters do become trusted friends and role models. So it's not only about reaching girls in many countries that would have no other access through our work, but it's also about modeling for young girls possibilities they may never have dreamed of, and showing young boys that it's okay for girls to have various role experiences, or that women can have different roles and responsibilities, that girls can go to school. The thing I will say is, I think everyone here knows investing in women and girls' education also leads to a more equitable, stable, productive, and peaceful world. I have one other example that I almost hesitate to say because it's a bit heartbreaking right now, but I think it does speak to the power of media and Muppets, if you will. In our Afghan production, which was on the air for 10 years, we created local Afghan Sesame Street called Bache Simpson, which means Sesame Garden in Dari and Pashto. And because girls' education and gender equity was a key curricular goal, we created Zari. And she's this adorable Muppet. She wears her school uniform and her hijab. And the research showed that not only, were we reaching almost 4 million children through radio, television, Bache Simpson, but we tested not only literacy and numeracy gains, but attitudes around gender equity. And little boys who watched, and believe me, it was the #1 appeal, and in terms of Zari, she was the favorite character of boys and girls. Little boys who watched tested 29% higher on attitudes of gender equity, saying it's fine for girls to go to school. And when the State Department, who had funded the work, did qualitative research, they found in focus groups that again and again, fathers cited Bache Simpson as the reason they'd changed their mind about permitting their daughters to go to school. And I think, again, that's because it's probably non-threatening. It's a children's show. We're modeling that throughout in our live action films that are part of interstitials, as well as our Muppet segments. But I think it really shows that we can plant the seeds for societal change attitudes, open hearts. Again, Afghanistan is not a great story today. We're not in production for obvious reasons, but that doesn't take away from what we accomplished and what we can accomplish by reaching children and modeling these behaviors.
So you've talked about how you really sort of customize and tailor these shows by region and by culture, but there's also some core tenets at the heart of a lot of this, some common threads that we see, things that strike at basic human emotions like love and truth and empathy and compassion. So I wanted to just ask you about the universal, what's universal about the programming that you do? What are the similarities that you actually see in this all across the globe, and when it comes to content?
Well, the ones you mentioned would be good, yes. Love and truth and empathy and compassion. I mentioned gender equity. I would also add joy and hope. What Sesame does is we are able to tackle really difficult issues often people think of as adult issues: homelessness, displacement, parental incarceration, parental addiction, but always from the lens of a child and always in hopeful ways. So to your point, when you see Big Bird and Elmo talking about challenging issues or characters that are experiencing those issues, you saw a few in the video, it helps children feel less alone, but it also helps children who aren't experiencing those gain empathy. And I do think Julia, the first ever autistic Muppet, is a great example of that. That entire program, which is ongoing and now not just in the US, but in many countries around the world, is about helping to see amazing in all children. And it started as both an opportunity to create resources for families with children with autism, to make everyday moments easier, give them tools and resources, but also to help all children understand autism. I think you saw in the video, it helps, like when Elmo introduces Julia to Abby, he explains that just because she doesn't look you in the eye doesn't mean she doesn't want to be your friend. And so for children to see themselves in Julia, but for other children to understand what they have in common and the differences and why. There's so much research we have on qualitative research that showed 1 out of 2 Americans knew about Julia, and half of those who did had had conversations about autism with friends or family members. I mean, that's really powerful. And of course, anecdotally, we would hear from moms who said because of Julia, their children had more play dates, from teachers who would say that because of Julia, their classrooms were more inclusive. And I think that speaks to the power of empathy.
So much more than just a children's program,
Oh,
right? I mean,
well,
it's driving
that's the
conversation
other
at all
thing
levels.
is that if a child thinks they can't ask why is Julia like that? If a parent thinks I'm not supposed to say she has autism, it becomes taboo. So if you can break down that stigma and make it okay to talk about, then it's less fear of the other. You know, we see that. I love an anecdote I saw recently, work we have in, I think it came out of Jordan, where one of our characters in our work in Ahlan Simpson and elsewhere is Amira. And Amira is a little girl Muppet who's in a wheelchair. And a teacher told us that they had a child in a wheelchair in the class, and all the other children were sort of afraid of it and would stay away and not quite understand. And that after they watched the content with Amira, she said now they all reach out to help. And I think that's, you know, so powerful.
So I want to talk about another universal truth, which I think affects everyone in this room, which is data. I think we all know how important it is to make evidence-based decision-making, and yet impact is difficult to measure. We know this, and often it can be measured in, I think it was said earlier in this program, generations and years, not necessarily weeks and months. Can you tell me a little bit about how Sesame uses evidence and builds evidence around early learning, especially in these conflict-affected countries?
I would love to. It is so important. And again, research is a huge part of Sesame's DNA. It started with a combination of research, educators, and the creators all working together, and that is universal wherever we go. There have also been more studies on the impact and effect of Sesame Street than any other children's property, which have shown long-term longitudinal gains. And I will say, speaking to your question specifically about regions of conflict and our humanitarian work, one of the things I'm so proud of is when we were fortunate enough to win the MacArthur grant, we took, and that was matched by LEGO to expand to Bangladesh. So of 2 $100 million grants, we've invested $30 million in research. There's a dearth of research on what's most effective for children in conflict settings. So we brought in NYU Global Ties, and they are doing research on both all our programs in the Middle East and in Bangladesh. We just finished 2 randomized controlled trials that will release the research in about 2 weeks. And I can give you sort of preliminary insight because I think it's so powerful. Keep in mind the reason we were creating this access to early childhood development in this region, right? Because we know how important it is to reach those children who've experienced trauma to help mitigate the negative impact. So then the research is designed to test our interventions. Are they working? And our local advisory, the question you had about how do we decide what we're going to do and how we do it, in Lebanon, Jordan, it was very clear that the Ahlan Simpson content needed to focus first on the emotional ABCs, that one of the biggest challenges was children not being able to identify their emotions, which you have to do to be able to manage your emotions, which you have to do in order to learn. So emotional ABCs is the curriculum. And one trial that was just completed was where we took the Ahlan Simpson programming in Jordan, working with the Ministry of Education, added those to schools so that every day children would see a 26-minute episode. And the research on those outcomes, compared to those who had not, increased ability to identify emotions, increased abilities to manage emotions, increased knowledge of coping skills like deep breathing. And the second study was in Lebanon. During COVID, there were so many things we couldn't do. We couldn't do home visits with the IRC. We couldn't be in person. So we created a remote preschool where IRC teachers were calling in to groups of 5 or 6 families, children and caregivers. They had access to materials digitally, materials for the children, and the outcome of 11 weeks of this program is the equivalent in literacy and numeracy gains to an entire year in in-person preschool. So it's just such an incredible validation of what we can do if we can reach children with quality early childhood development.
So I want to ask you a little bit more about this partnership that you spearheaded with the IRC to bring early education to those fleeing conflict in Syria. As we mentioned, it was recognized by the MacArthur Foundation and LEGO, 2 $100 million grants awarded.
Over 5 years, okay, it wasn't much. Yeah.
It's still pretty remarkable. I wanted to ask where this idea came from, how it manifested, and then maybe what lessons can be learned, and how have you sort of grown and changed the program since you started?
Yeah, thank you for that, because MacArthur grant was a game changer for Sesame. So often people don't know of our work or our need for philanthropic support, but the way it came about is when we saw, prior to MacArthur, when we saw the number of children displaced at the outset of the Syrian crisis, more children than any other time since World War II, because Sesame had a lot of experience in the Middle East, we had created productions in Egypt and, as I mentioned, in Palestine, in Jordan. We had a lot of content in Arabic. And so we thought, how could we help reach these children who've left everything behind, including schools and access to education? But we're not a direct service organization. We can create proven content, but we couldn't do it alone. We needed a partner on the ground. So we looked at a lot of different organizations that we work with, UNICEF, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, all of whom do wonderful work. But in that region at the time, we felt that the International Rescue Committee had a very strong footprint on the ground. They also had an early childhood development department and a head of ECD. They care very much about early years, and they cared very much about data and research. So I went to David Miliband and I asked, would you join us and do a pilot in Jordan? And let's see if our content could empower your IRC staff on the ground and help in terms of learning centers, home visits. And he agreed. Of course, we're 2 nonprofits. We have no money. But we went to the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, and it's unusual to announce a program when we have no money, but we thought we'll put a stake in the ground. And it did the trick. It led to funding from Bernard Van Leer and Open Society Foundations, just enough to start a pilot in Jordan. That's when I heard about MacArthur's 100 and change. And it was for any organization addressing a major need. And so I called David again and said, we're going to go for this, and I think we should go for it for our project together. And he agreed. So 1,900 applicants later, 18 months later, I never would have dreamed we would be the last one standing, and we were selected to receive this incredible, audacious grant. It allowed us to create the largest early childhood intervention. It was a combination of creating local media to reach children at mass, using that content for targeted programs like home visits, learning centers, working on the ground, and adding the research component. But in success, it was that we hoped we could create models that could be replicated for children wherever they may be and could transform humanitarian response. Because the thing that I learned that was so stunning, in spite of all of the evidence, we know how important it is those early years, especially for children experiencing conflict and crisis. Less than 2% of all humanitarian aid goes to early childhood. Less than 2%. So the great irony is the children impacted the most because of their age and their stage receive the least, and yet research shows they have the most to gain. So that's why I think this work is so important. And for LEGO to step up within 1 calendar year, they had never given to humanitarian before. They'd done wonderful work, the Lego Foundation, and we had worked with them in Mexico and South Africa, but they stepped up and said, you know what, we'd like to also do this. We're going to do another $100 million investment to deepen your work through learning through play and to expand it to reach children in the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh. And that has led to, our continued work to reach children affected by conflict and crisis around the world.
You've obviously proven your ability to continually innovate and pivot. So I wanted to ask you, what's next for Sesame? What's top of mind for you as you look to the future, and especially as it relates to the peace building field?
Well, as I said, what started in the Middle East expanded to Bangladesh, Africa, Latin America, and now, to your point, those displaced from Afghanistan, Ukraine, has really helped us learn a great deal. And what we're calling Welcome Sesame is to try to add to this foundation, what children need, especially those children affected by conflict and crisis, is the same regardless of the geography. But in the Middle East, you can reach children whether they're in a refugee camp or in a host community through media. It's ubiquitous. They have access to smartphones and satellite. We go to Bangladesh, they don't have any access to media. Now we're doing like battery-operated Pico projectors in BRAC play labs. Then we go to Latin America. Wait a minute, it's neither. They're not in host communities. They're not in one large camp. They're on the move. And so we're innovating again and using WhatsApp and chatbots and digital hubs where they can download content. So consequently, we are learning to be innovative, both high-tech and low-tech. How do we reach children and families with quality early learning resources and help those caregivers with the tools they need and often training? And how can we invest in even more content that is easily adaptable to the next crisis? And that's a huge priority for us. And to your point in terms of peace building, to some of the earlier examples, and again, this audience, I don't want to quote things they've heard a million times, but to me, a powerful thing is Mandela talking about children don't learn hate. They do learn hate. They're not born hating or because of people having a different color of skin or background. They're taught to hate. And we can also teach love. And that work in Kosovo, I will never forget the head of the UNICEF, the head of UNICEF in Kosovo, who was our partner. Her name was, Marjorie, you may remember, Rosie Fief. And she said about our work there that even if Sesame can't completely convert these children, the fact that they are helping them be more open-minded than their parents, and when they grow up to be parents, they will be that much more accepting than their parents, and the next generation will have so much more hope. And I think that's where Sesame can continue to make a huge difference.
Well, I know we've talked a lot about the various toolkits that you're providing both kids and their caregivers, and mental health is now is the new one that you announced this week.
We did. Well, emotional well-being is so important for children to be able to thrive. And we know there's so many things that the pandemic, they were issues already, but the pandemic exacerbated those issues. And emotional well-being and mental health is another issue that people think of as an adult issue, and yet it's so important that we look at it from a lens of a child.
So I know we're running out of time, but I thought we'd maybe end with something hopeful, and ask you, what gives you hope right now? And there's a lot of things that I think worry many of us in this room, but what's the silver lining?
I would say what gives me hope, even though I mentioned less than 2% goes to early childhood, because of the work of organizations like the Early Childhood Peace Coalition and the Yale Child Center, Jim Leckman, who's done amazing work on this, and building evidence on the fact that reaching children with quality early childhood development does lead to peace building and social cohesion and sustainable development. Another organization, the Early Childhood Development Action Network, which is doing incredible work to help elevate the awareness of the importance in investing in early childhood, to change policies, to get others to understand this is the greatest return on investment we could make. And that gives me hope, because if we look as children as the catalyst for social change, to me, giving those children and the next generation the tools to build a better world is not just, something that sounds nice. It's actually where we can make the biggest difference. So that the fact that that's increasing awareness and understanding, there's still a long way to go, believe me, but to me that does give me hope.
That's great. Do we want to try and take a question from the audience? Are you okay with that?
It's up to you. I mean, I'm fine with it, but I don't know your time. There's a couple over there.
Okay, sorry. Hi, my name is Sanjay. I'm also an educator. I work in Colombia.
I was just in Colombia.
Huh?
I was just in Colombia. Love.
Very
Yes.
cool, very cool. And so I obviously agree with you, and I agree in the power of technology to reach people. I had a question for you, and it's like, if you imagine Sesame what would Sesame for like teenagers be like? And it's like, there is this thing of you work with kids work with their parents, and then there's this thing of teenagers who do not want to be with their parents. Well, or like it's the moment of like you're creating your autonomy. If you were to do the version of Sesame for teenagers, for youth, what would that look like?
Maybe we'll take 3 questions
okay,
so you
sure,
can
sure.
answer all of them.
Try to remember if you'll help me. This-
Okay.
Hi there, my name is Matthew. I work for Equal Access International. My question deals a little bit with sensitive issues. I watched the series on Apple TV Plus, Dear Big Bird, and it really spoke to the human impact of talking about really sensitive issues.
Wait, sorry, you watched the series. I couldn't hear that one.
Dear Big Bird
Oh.
on Apple TV Plus is really great. But in today's context where education is sometimes weaponized, how do you approach talking about sensitive issues when education becomes so politicized?
It's a really good question. Thank you.
Last question. All right, I'm going to the front.
Thank you. As others have said, very inspiring. With the youth movement that we see today, just incredible ability to organize and inspire, older generations. Has Sesame explored any ways of like activating kids beyond the content, and the parents seeing the content? Have they explored anything around organizing children or youth to build the cause up?
Okay. All right. I'll try to take these in order. So starting with the target age group and what would Sesame look like for older. It's interesting because I mentioned the fact that Sesame is deliberately designed to appeal to adults as well as children. And so when you think of some of the clever parodies, and it works on 2 levels. A child doesn't understand that parody on Game of Thrones, but the learning outcomes are still work, and it was funny, but then the parent gets a kick out of it. So I think if there were a Sesame Street for adolescents or teens, it would have the same concept, in terms of appealing to those things that they find relevant and humorous. And we have done work for older kids, Electric Company, various different projects, but because of what I was saying earlier, the need to reach children in those critical early years and the fact that is our sweet spot and our expertise, I think that it is so important that we continue to focus on reaching more children in those early years wherever we can. But I would say today more than ever, we are also focused on the caregiver. Our work in humanitarian response is not just the child, it is essential that we're reaching that caregiver, helping support them and helping give them tools because they're so overwhelmed themselves. It's all in service of the child, but we are much more deliberate about reaching caregivers as well as children. Okay, the second question was how do we deal with increasing polarization around difficult issues. It's hard. It's really hard. But what we try to do is stay true to our North Star, and that is what is in the best interest of children, what is the impact, and understanding our audience. I mean, this is 0 to 5. This, you know, the 3-year-olds have to be able to benefit from our content. But in a world, you know, when COVID was going on, we had Big Bird get vaccinated when it was okay for children to be vaccinated. To your point, that became a huge political issue where we were attacked for being White House propaganda. But I was telling Alan last night, one of my favorite things was when that criticism came out, which was also quite partisan, and it's, you know, another fan immediately put up a video of Big Bird getting vaccinated in 1972 for measles. And I was like, yes. But we just, you know, it's tough, but we just have to continue to do what we feel is truly based on research and based on children's needs. And then the last question was, activating children, right, thank you. We have done a lot of work around, interestingly enough, children even at a young age can become stewards of their environment, about helping others, you know, planting those seeds for good citizenship and becoming, feeling empowered that they can make a difference. We're doing some work in India right now around climate, which is absolutely designed to help engage and be catalysts to change their parents' attitudes and behaviors. And we've seen that in Africa with our WASH work. It's not like you can really go get a group of 3- and 4-year-olds to, you know, activate, but in terms of planting those seeds and helping them understand our work around coming together, we've always stood for you know, diversity, inclusion. But after the incidents in the U.S., George Floyd being killed, we had to look hard, what more can we do? And of course, we always bring in advisors and what would be the most effective way. And we went from just modeling diversity inclusion to giving parents tools and addressing racism directly. How can you talk about racism to a 3-year-old? We created new characters. Wes is the father of Elijah, so that we could model conversations. And in that, it's really designed to help children celebrate their own identity, but be upstanders for themselves and one another. And again, that is really trying to help them understand how they can be a part of the change.
Well, I think personally I found that incredibly inspiring. I want to thank you on behalf of AFP. I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here. And personally, I want to thank you for being here. It's a real honor. And thanks for all you do to contribute to a more peaceful global community.
Thank you. And thank all of you, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't care so much about this issue. And the work you're doing is so important. So thank you again.